Hello and welcome to this Blackwell Online podcast. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Ian Davidson, former foreign affairs columnist and Paris correspondent of the Financial Times. Ian is the author of a previous book on Voltaire's later years in exile, but for his new book, entitled simply Voltaire, A Life, he has encompassed the whole span of Voltaire's 84 years, and therefore much of the intellectual life of the 18th century, in a single volume. And an eventful 84 years they certainly were. This Parisian lawyer's son was by his death not only one of the most famous and controversial men in France, but also across the whole of Europe, the very prototype of the modern celebrity intellectual. His complete works run to dozens of volumes. His collected letters number over 15,000. There was little he wasn't interested in, from the latest scientific discoveries to crime and punishment. So much so that his name has become synonymous with the values of the Enlightenment, a beacon of tolerance and the right to free speech. And yet, how could it be otherwise? His life has also become encrusted with myths which Ian, in the book, attempts to scrape away. When I spoke to him on the phone about his book recently, we began with an aspect of Voltaire's career that is almost forgotten today, but which in his own day was right at the top of his claims to fame over many decades, his career as a playwright.
Oh, absolutely. This also, when I first looked into the question, also amazed me. He thought of himself, and he made his career as a playwright, and then as a poet, because he wrote a long epic poem, and France hadn't got any tradition of epic poetry. It did have a very big tradition of classical verse tragedy, going back to the previous century, the 17th century, with Corneille and Racine and many others. And the theatre was at the kind of the central place for public entertainment. So everybody went to the theatre that could, and everybody wanted to write for the theatre because it was like writing for Hollywood. Mm. So Voltaire decided this is what he was going to do as well. So he set out to write a play, and he in fact, his first play, which was essentially drawn from the Greek play by Sophocles about Oedipus. He made his own version of it. It was his first play, and it was a fantastic success. And all of a sudden, he became the star. And he went on writing plays right until tragedies, and comedies, but mainly tragedies, until the end of his life. And for a long period, in fact, his plays were by far the most important source of income for the Comédie Française, outperforming both Racine and Corneille. Now, what's so interesting about this is that his plays have gone. First of all, he was trying to keep going a form of verse tragedy, which had been current in the 17th century, but it was steadily going out of fashion, and he tried to kind of recapture the past because he believed that the 17th century was the great period of French culture, but he couldn't quite keep it up. And eventually, towards the end of his life, he kept on writing plays which didn't either get performed or didn't get performed to any success. And in fact, his plays are never performed in France now. So this is one reason why people don't know that he was famous in his lifetime as a playwright, because no one goes to his plays anymore.
One thing which comes out very strongly from the book is the sheer difficulty of publishing in 18th century France, because on one hand, you had no copyright protection for authors, and on the other hand, you had very, very tough censorship. So say a little bit about how Voltaire sort of navigated between those difficulties, because they clearly deeply influenced his publishing career.
Yeah, well, the one thing that is very clear is that the censorship really affected anything in prose. And he didn't have, I think, any serious censorship problems with his tragedies. Now, I don't quite know what the system was. I know that the Comédie Française was under the supervision of the court, but there's no trace in his letters of his having to submit his plays to official censorship. On the other hand, anything that he wrote in prose immediately came up against the censorship problems. And one of the reasons for that was that when he started writing in prose, he was writing about stuff like the history of Louis XIV, for example, which is an enormous history book that he wrote. he knew this was going to be very dangerous for the childish reason that he knew that if he wrote anything good about Louis XIV, this would be taken in Versailles as a criticism of Louis XV. And so, in fact, he could not get it published in France legally. And the way he dealt with this problem, like all writers who were writing at the edge of controversy in France, they had two options. One, they could publish it anonymously in France, which is quite dangerous, or they could publish it abroad and then smuggle copies into France. And Voltaire did both these things. In the case of the book that he wrote about England when he was a young man, he started by getting it published in England in English, and then he had an anonymous edition published secretly in France the following year. He thought he could control how this book was going to be trickled out, but suddenly he found he had two rival anonymous editions coming out in France from two rival publishers, and at that point, the balloon went up. The authorities got enraged. They condemned the book. They put out an arrest warrant and sent policemen to put Voltaire in prison, and he ran away just in time. One of the consequences of this crux between censorship and the absence of copyright was that it was extremely difficult, virtually impossible, to make a living as a writer in France if you were writing about anything that was at all controversial.
And he achieves an astonishing coup, really makes his fortune by means of the French lottery. I was astonished when I read that page because it's almost like within the space of 12 months he goes from penury to being a rich man. So how did that come about? Because that really set him up for the rest of his career, didn't it?
Well, it was after he came back from England, and he got in touch with some of his old friends, including a mathematician called La Condamine, who was a mathematician and a scientist of quite wide talents. Anyway, La Condamine one day was looking at the public prospectus for a government lottery. And the government lottery had been issued by the government in order somehow to stimulate sales of government bonds, because the government was always short of money, so it was always it was in deficit, just like us. It was always having to raise money in the money markets, but finding it very difficult because people didn't trust the government to be able to finance this deficit. So in this year of 1729, Voltaire and his friend, but it was particularly his friend La Condamine, noticed the terms of a lottery which had been introduced by the government, so that one of the prizes was an incitement to get people to buy government bonds. And what La Condamine noticed in reading the small print was that the prizes given out by the government were going to be worth more than the total ticket sales for the lottery. So he and Voltaire and a number of others, and I don't know how many others, but it was quite a little group, put their forces together, and they cornered the market in lottery tickets, and they made a fortune. They all made a fortune. And the government tried to stop it because they suddenly worked out the arithmetic. So they tried to stop the process of this lottery. But the law court said, no, they couldn't do that. So one of those curious things, we think of the Ancien Regime as being absolutist, but actually it also had kind of a creaky legal system as well. So anyway, so for a year, Voltaire and La Condamine and his friends were just raking it in, and by the end of the year, when it stopped, Voltaire had made a large amount of money, possibly the equivalent of 1 million livres, 1 million francs, but nobody knows exactly how much, but it was very, very substantial. And that was really the basis on which he lived for the rest of his life, not from his books.